You're listening to Speaking of Faith with Bishop D.D. Duncan Proby of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York. I'm Rachel Ravelette, or Romcom, and we're glad you're here.
Welcome, friends, to this podcast. I am so grateful to be gathering with you and with Deacon Kay Drabert today. My name is D.D. Duncan Proby. I'm the Diocesan Bishop of the Episcopal Church in Central New York. That's Canada to Pennsylvania, Utica to Elmira, and all the beautiful places and people in between. And I'm joined by Rachel Ravelette, who's our Communications Director. And this podcast is about speaking of faith. I think over the years, we've lost the ability to talk about our faith, especially in reference to current life and everyday situations. Now, this is a special podcast because in the Diocese of Central New York this past week, there was an incident of a DWI, a driving while intoxicated event, and it has really triggered and brought to the fore the need to have conversations around addiction and sobriety about how we live in our humanity in this time. And so I'm very grateful to have Deacon Kay with us. She's a bivocational deacon in the diocese. She is also a senior licensed clinician at Shenango County Behavioral Health. And welcome, Kay, to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you, Bishop.
So can you tell us a little about you and how you got into social work and some of what you do?
Sure. So, long story short, I think I always wanted to be a therapist, but I spent a lot of my life in the corporate world. And about 10 years ago, I go, this isn't even suiting me anymore. I should go back to what I always wanted to do. And I went back to school to become a clinical social worker. And in my first internship that I had, I was working with young children, very young children, elementary school age children, and all of them were suffering from trauma because their parents were using substances. And it just occurred to me at that time that, you know what, I want to really work with the people at the core of the problem, because all of those were such sad stories. So by my second internship, I worked in an inpatient facility, and then really gained a lot of knowledge there and learned to love this group of people so much. People in recovery are some of the most courageous people I know. Their lives are inspiring to me. I spend a lot of time advocating for them, trying to get them the resources they need, which still in our world are a little bit limited. So I will do this work until I can't anymore. I just absolutely love it.
That is wonderful. And can you tell me, or tell our listeners especially, when we talk about substance abuse and especially about addictive behaviors, there are so many ways people kind of come into this conversation, whether it's, and so many ways we look at it, whether through the lens of a victim or someone who's dealing with their own addiction, or Al-Anon, someone who's a relative. And so this is a very multivalent topic, and I want to say to the listeners, if you find anything about this is triggering or difficult, that I encourage you to reach out to a trusted friend to find either therapy or help or support to not go on this journey alone. These are difficult topics we'll be talking about. So with that caveat, what are some important things, Deacon Kay, that you think are important to remember about conversations that deal with substance abuse and addiction?
I think an important thing to do is to assure the person you're talking with or your loved ones, whatever, to do your best not to be judgmental, to accept the person where they are in that moment. And just not to pressure them to make any changes, but to listen and to hear their stories. Sometimes just being present for them is the first step towards their healing. I like to use person-centered language too. I think words really do make a difference to people. So use people with substance use disorders rather than an addict or an alcoholic. It's a much more positive image. So to use that kind of language is important, um, especially for them. It starts building trust with them when they know that, and it helps them to know that you're not judging them. Um, Another tip is to give them time just to tell their story, and to maybe offer them help. But if they don't want it, then that's okay too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I know that there's also been a conversation about whether substance abuse is a disease or a moral failing, and it sounds like you've answered that a little bit in terms of not being judgmental. But what are some things that might surprise the listeners about how to think about these issues?
Yeah. I mean, the history of it is that, of course, it's a moral failing, but as we've learned more, it's not. And it's a mental health diagnosis, and there's certain criteria that need to be met to have that official diagnosis. So drinking a beer here and there, a couple times a month, even a couple times a week, isn't a substance use disorder. But if someone is doing 4 or 5 drinks every night, every day, then it most certainly is. So there's kind of clinical criteria that we use to determine that. And then we treat that as primarily a mental health condition because I would say at least 90% of the clients we treat here also have some kind of mental health condition. And that's usually at the root of why they started abusing substances to begin with. So um, that's a big piece of it. More recently, there's a whole harm reduction movement that you may have heard of that approaches this as, well, a person who's using substances in a way that they shouldn't doesn't necessarily, to become well, have to stop all use and end everything right away, because that doesn't really work. Because people look down the road and like, I can't envision myself never having a drink again or never smoking cannabis again. So we take the approach that, okay, tell me, what could you start to do? For some people, it might be as simple, I'm going to cut things down in half to start out with, start setting some reasonable goals. For other people, especially those with opioid use disorders, it might be choosing to go on medically assisted treatment, which is primarily Suboxone, Sublocade, things like that, that help control their cravings and help them manage their use and to eventually stop using. So there's a whole variety of techniques we use to help them get to this point where they really want to be, where they're not harming themselves anymore. Much like we would do with someone whose mental health was suffering and we wanted to work on suicide prevention. It's very similar to that.
And
That
would you say
sounds
then
so
that
hopeful.
it does? And would you
It
say that for
is.
some people this is a form of self-medicating, that they're suffering with
Oh,
depression or
absolutely.
something else? And so this is a way of sort of navigating. Yeah.
It is.
So what are some of the warning signs, like for ourselves or for those we love? I mean, you mentioned the 4 or 5 drinks a night versus 3 or 4 a week, but what are some signs in terms of other issues that may be
Sure. The biggest
contributing?
one is, especially if you're close to people, um, and this can be something that the church could be very helpful in. Someone stops coming, just dropped out. Something's going on with that person. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know for sure what it is. There could be all kinds of things in life, but that's a big thing for me. When people start to isolate, there's usually something going on that's bothering them, or maybe they've started using. I recognize that in my own clients. They stop coming to my appointments and I call them, okay, so what's going on? Can I help you? Because that's the tendency. They're trying to not let you know that they're using. And there's a lot of times an element of shame or guilt around it.
Mm-hmm.
So they really are pretty good at trying to hide it. Although, in my experience, if you watch them and if you know people, they're not very good at doing that. So they might,
Mm-hmm.
if it's someone who's still in school, you're going to have grades dropping, change in friendships, changes in things they like to do,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe secretiveness. In adults, it could be that they're missing a lot of work, or they get fired, or they stop attending other social events with family or planned events, or they start their mood changes, their behavior changes, so they might become more argumentative or more combative even.
Mm-hmm.
So the big mood changes that you wouldn't normally expect of a person.
Okay.
For some types of use, there's some physical changes. For, say, a methamphetamine user, there is going to be a lot of loss of weight, a lot of sleeplessness, um, and a lot of sores on their arms and their faces. That comes
Mm-hmm.
from what the chemical is doing from their body. And I think we all know with someone who has been drinking too much, the slurred speech, the inability to not walk in a straight line, all the things that law enforcement would use, those things are readily evident. For
Mm-hmm.
someone who's using opioids, it would be a lot. A person could just, they call it nodding off. They just kind of in conversation there. I mean, it's slowing their body down. Maybe their breathing is even slower. So those kind of physical things. And then there is a new, well, it's not technically an opioid because it's not a heroin related drug, but xylazine is a new substance. It's actually a veterinary tranquilizer
Wow.
that people are using to really improve their high, and it can cause like open wounds on a person's body and
Mm-hmm.
abscesses because of what it does to the body, and that it knocks a person out. They'll sleep for hours and hours and lose circulation to their body parts. So those are some of the physical signs.
Mm-hmm. And are there steps that parishes can take to be safer places for those struggling with these disorders?
I think so. I think if people know that the church is already hosting NA or AA, it's a good first step, that people are
Mm-hmm.
coming in and out of there. I would say if you could get like availability of let people know that there's Narcan kits available at the church, so people need them, they're there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to me, it's much like having a defibrillator on hand at a church, to have something to help people if they need it, and to maybe even do some trainings. Narcan is so much more readily available now. In most communities, you can find someone who's doing a training.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think,
So,
yeah,
okay.
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, listening to you, I'm really struck by treating this a lot much the way we would treat heart disease or asthma or
Mhm.
something that's a pre-existing condition in a way, where we're creating space where people can seek help and have and readily get help
Mhm.
that lacks judgment but is focused on the real issues at hand, is what I'm hearing you say in different ways.
Mhm.
Is that accurate in
Exactly.
that? And what are some easy steps to take to prevent these diseases, especially or disorders, especially like for ourselves or for those we love? Ways in which, I've already had people in the diocese say, "Well, we should make sure we never serve alcohol in anything," and and so are there ways that we can be a safe place without becoming kind of enmeshed or codependent in terms of
I think so. And to your point, it's not realistic to say never have alcohol. I mean, because I think we teach how to responsibly drink. Um,
Mhm.
and there's some guidelines, and it's based on some national guidelines of what is healthy drinking. And so for women and people over age 65, that's really no more than 2 drinks a day or 10 a week. And for men, that's no more than 3 drinks in a night or 14 a week. So to kind of use that as a platform to manage and set some goals for ourselves of how we're going to manage our drinking. If we lived in Canada, their national task force says to drink nothing. So ours are a little different. But I think that's reasonable. And, I think it bears reflecting on it. I mean, I always reflect on it in Lent and try to do with less, just like I do with other things. So it's a good time of the year for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's perhaps a good thing to talk about it as we prepare for holidays, because that is always when, especially alcohol consumption, just goes through the roof. Um,
At
I
this
think
time, are you seeing more cases of substance abuse or these disorders? Are you seeing a reduction, or is it always kind of stay the same? Is there any sort of flux with what we're seeing in terms of
does
people's usage?
fluctuate. I think summer is lighter because people have a wide variety of things to do
Mm,
besides go for a drink or to do some other recreational drug use. This time of the year, people tend to be more depressed and isolated. They're not going out, so the tendency to drink or use is much, much higher, especially after the holidays. There's like this big letdown that people feel after the holidays, and mental health is also gets a little worse during January as well. The fortunate thing is the light is starting to come back, so
mhm,
people are starting to improve. I think overall substance use just seems to be going up and up. Um,
mhm,
it's, and I don't, I see it more in a rural basis, but I talk to my colleagues in more urban environments. They see the same thing. Um, I think we hear in the media a lot of conversations around opioid use. And so we know that the risk is increasing and what's in an opioid has changed, but we don't hear a lot about the methamphetamine use, which is really prevalent in our area of the country, or alcohol use, which has always been an issue in this part of country. So, and I've seen alcohol use just really keep climbing during COVID and since COVID. A lot of people who were doing just fine before that, when during all that isolation, they started to drink again.
mm. And how would you talk about with cannabis use or alcohol? There's this conversations. I even saw one today actually online about that it's better to smoke pot than it is to drink a beer. Um,
Mm.
uh, is there any sort of like comparison there? Is that kind of not a reality?
It's hard to compare them because they do different things to your brain and impact different parts of your brain. Alcohol is a depressant, so that's what makes it the most dangerous and puts a person at risk. Whereas cannabis is really um, mind mind altering and can
Mm,
affect your judgment. You can have um, a paranoia that goes with it, or feel something's happening that's not real. So, I mean, it's kind of, you can't compare the two of them
mm-hmm,
because they're both legal, used responsibly. Neither one of them is that dangerous. It's when people might decide to operate heavy equipment or drive, or they have to make an important decision that become problematic. The
mm-hmm,
thing to remember about cannabis use is it's like people like to say it's not your grandfather's cannabis. It's much stronger. Edibles, when you take one, it'll hit you 2 hours later and you didn't expect it to be that forceful. It's much stronger. So you kind of caution if someone is going to use something like that is to use a very small amount and kind of try it out.
mm-hmm. And it used to be, speaking of grandfather's pot, it used to be that the conversation was if you need to have a drink, that's a warning sign. If you feel like you're stressed and it's like, oh, I need a drink because today was a hard day, or if you can't go like a period of time, 2 weeks or something, without having a drink, without it feeling emotionally impactful, that those are really critical kind of red flags for usage. Is that still true, or has that changed a bit?
That's still true because people will say, "Hey, I'm going to go have a drink," even here, despite the work we do, right? So
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's in our mindsets that we need to have that rather than think of what else we could do to relax. I think
Hmm.
it's one of those things we have to replace drinking or using with other activities. And so maybe it's I'm going to go home and take a walk, or
Hmm.
I'm going to go to the gym on the way home. So it's kind of like more of a wellness thing. The
Hmm.
substance we put in our body, whether we feel they're natural or not in a large amount, still are
Hmm.
doing something negative to it. And so maybe we could do something more positive. Or maybe, if you're not into physical activity, I'm going to call my friend when I get home. I could really use a lift today. The
Hmm.
bright spot about that is maybe they could too. So all kinds of different things we could place with those kinds of activities.
Well, I really hear you talking a lot about the power of community in this, and that
Mm-hmm.
with whether it's the person who's has a disorder or using, especially in terms of the mental illness, with depression or the isolation, and of course we have a chronic right now, the loneliness. The reports
Mm-hmm.
about how lonely people are is just very high, and this, and across demographics, children, teenagers, elderly, that there's this real sense of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And our diocesan ministry is a world healed by love, and our mission statement is learning to love God, one another, and all God's creation. And this seems to me like a place where our diocesan mission and ministry, this is at the core of it, is how we are community together and support one another. What
Mm-hmm.
are some ways that or what are some sort of final thoughts you might have about how we all could be more effective in community together? Um,
So I think we talk about it. It's much like I think a lot of people are comfortable talking about people's substance use, no matter what
mhm,
it is. So I think we need to be in that conversation. If we're teaching our young people about the scripture and about, you know, what the Episcopal Church is all about, we also teach them how to live healthy lives, and this would be a piece of it. And I think if we're talking about to living healthy, balanced lives, then leadership in the church balances that as well. It's kind of
mhm,
like, and that's why I said wellness before. I think it's this approach to living balanced lives and learning how to manage our stress, because I think almost everybody I know talks to me about stress and being
mhm,
overstressed. And I think that's an important thing to talk about and how to
mhm,
manage that. Um, it's much like if there were people in our congregations that we're concerned about their mental health, we would try to direct family and friends to help them get treatment. Maybe talk to their primary care provider, which is always a great place to start with this to get the right referrals. But to talk about that, because not talking about it makes the problem worse.
mhm,
To recognize that this is a reality for a lot of people that we see on a weekly basis. These are issues that seem somewhat hidden, but people don't need to no longer feel embarrassed or guilty about it. They just need someone who can listen to them and help them direct them to the resources that could be helpful to them.
mhm.
Deacon
Well,
Kay,
it is okay.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate in this conversation uh, the move away from all or nothing thinking.
Mhm.
I think that you've brought so much hope to this space by talking about small things that we can do to move in a more healthy direction, and not I think it's a holdover from seeing addiction as a moral feeling, right? This
Yep.
you can't ever think about it. I really appreciate the way you've encouraged us to make health oriented decisions rather than bans. I think that's so much more
Uh-huh.
invitational, so much more hopeful. Thank you.
Mhm,
Thank you. And there is so much hope in it. I mean, this is totally treatable, you know,
mhm,
and but for people who are in recovery to feel that they're supported and is just an amazing thing. It will help them maintain that, give them encouragement when they feel like, oh, I'm going to go back to what I used to do. It's just so important for people in recovery to know there's many, many people surrounding them and are willing to help them with their journey.
Mm-hmm. Well, Deacon Kay, I really appreciate having this conversation with you today. And I think there's been a lot of helpful information in this podcast for people listening. And to the people listening, I want to reiterate that if this is triggering for you, or if this is thought provoking, to see your care provider or to speak with a trusted counselor or someone who listens and will be supportive. And to know that God loves you and that God is calling all of us to wholeness and health, that we are created to live full lives. And so my prayer for all of us is that we will make those positive decisions that lead to well-being, for ourselves and those around us and in our communities and our wider world. And so this day, know that you are loved, and may you be blessed in this journey of health and healing. And I look forward to speaking with you next on the next podcast. God be with you.
Thanks for joining us. Speaking of Faith with Bishop Dede is a production of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York. Our theme music is by Fleece Mob, and it's called A Bird in Hand. We use it with permission. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcasting app so that you can be the first to know when new episodes are available. If you like what you've heard here, please leave us a rating and review. If you don't like what you've heard here, we're sure you're still a wonderful person, but maybe don't leave us a review? Just kidding. We love honest feedback and questions. You can connect with us online between episodes at cnyepiscopal.org/podcast and on social media at CNY Episcopal. Blessings to you, friends.